All right, it seems like a couple others are having some trouble getting in, so I am going to share the meeting link with them, but I don't want to hold us off too much further. So I'm going to start my video really fast. Katie can kind of launch into the introduction, and then hopefully we'll be able to get everyone else who's having trouble in here. All right, let's see if video is going to work for me. Yep. Okay. So hi to the two of you. We are so pleased to introduce Katie. She is, I believe, founder, yes, of Moonshot. And she is going to speak today on the topic of forecasting essentials for fashion designers. And, without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Katie. I'm going to stop my video and try to help everybody else get in. But yeah, take it away, Katie.
Thanks, Chloe. Hey, Chloe, can you make me the host so I can share?
Of course. Sorry about that.
That's okay. Thank you. Hi, nice to meet you both, Abigail and Liesel.
Nice to meet you.
All right. Oh my goodness. Okay, here we go. All right, you should be all set.
Yeah, okay. There we go. Yeah. All right. Okay, so thank you, Chloe, for the introduction. My name is Katie Irving, and I am really excited to talk today about a topic that I built my entire career on and am very passionate about, and that is customer centricity. And more specifically, we're going to talk about the value of customer centricity within fashion forecasting. So at its heart, it's a really simple concept. It's one of the oldest concepts in retail, putting the customer first and putting them at the heart of everything that you do as a brand. But what I'm going to show today in these slides is how the evolution of the trend cycle over the past 2 decades has really shifted the focus away from the customer towards chasing trends. So I'm going to dig into the effect that this has had on brands, and most importantly, we're going to talk about how to get back on track, and for brands, how to get out of reaction mode. I'm also going to walk you through a few of my favorite examples of customer-centric fashion today. And then when we get to the end of the session today, I'm going to walk through how to build a customer persona that's really grounded in data, but something that you can do in your project work, something that you can do yourself, and it will be a really helpful tool for you as you're designing. So before we dive into these big topics today, let me start with a quick intro. You're probably wondering, who is this person? So I will tell you. So I am the founder of Moonshot Consulting Agency. So I'll explain a little bit more about Moonshot on the next page. But as for my background, I've been working in fashion forecasting for nearly 2 decades. I started my career in luxury fashion with Chloe back in the Phoebe Philo days in Paris. And I spent more than a decade working with teen retailers. So there's definitely been some range happening. You'll see from the brands there. So most recently, I was the consulting director of fashion at WGSN, where I led their advisory projects and grew their consulting business within North America and Europe. So prior to that, for more than a decade, I was the head of concept at Abercrombie and Fitch. And the other brands that you see on the list here, they've been consulting clients of Moonshot over the past several years. So over the past couple of years, I've worked with Farfetch and I've worked with Walmart and a lot of brands in between those two. So it's really given me kind of a continuous view of really large sections of consumer culture and behavior. So for me, it's very much about who the customer is and what are the right products to meet their needs. And this is exactly the type of work that I do with brands now. So speaking of now, as I mentioned, Moonshot is the consulting agency that I founded back in 2020. So our flagship service is white space forecasting. So this is a process where we forecast future opportunities for brands that are really deeply rooted in the unmet needs of their customers. So as you'll see throughout the presentation today, making customers feel seen, make them feel heard and valued, that is our jam. That is what we do. So we're going to talk a lot about customer centricity today, but before we dig into that, it's really important to start with a look at how drastically the trend cycle has shifted over the past 2 decades. So this is a really important piece of the puzzle when it comes to understanding why building products for true actual consumer needs is a winning strategy over just chasing popular trends. So let's start with a look at how the trend cycle has shifted over the past 2 decades. And in the industry that we're all part of, chasing trends was a really solid business strategy for many decades. A lot of companies made a lot of money chasing trends for a really long time. But it's not a good business strategy now. So let's explore that evolution and understand a little bit more about why and how that happened. So this is a pretty good representation of popular trend headlines from the past few months. You probably recognize some of these. A lot of them end with the word core. The common thread here is obviously TikTok, right? But this is kind of a nightmare for brands to navigate, right? Like if you're a brand and you're looking at this and you're trying to read culture and figure out what you're doing, you're wearing 50 hats right now. You're placing bets in a lot of different directions. So it's hard. So it's a strategy that I like to call spaghetti on the wall. So it's like throw a few things out there and see what lands with the customer. Not to mention, a lot of the trends that are referenced on this page were already over by the time these publications had even written about them. So yikes. So let's understand really how we got to this place by understanding where we were just 10 or 15 years ago. The cerulean blue sweater scene from The Devil Wears Prada illustrates how the industry worked for decades. And if you haven't seen the movie for a while, or if you haven't seen the movie, this is the scene where Miranda Priestly is reacting to Andy kind of scoffing at the choice of these two similar turquoise belts. So Miranda's epic monologue really explains to Andy that even though she thinks that this is completely ridiculous, that Andy's actually wearing a sweater in a color that Miranda and her team picked a few years back. So, just really understanding like how far reaching, the fashion influence was. And it was true for many years that the people standing in Miranda's office really did dictate the trends. So another way to illustrate this is the chart that we have on the left here. So this is the classic trickle-down trend pyramid. So for many years, this is how the fashion system worked. Ideas came from the top, they worked their way down to different areas of the markets, and then there was some bubble up happening here too, where popular culture would occasionally insert some trends into the mix. If we think about like grunge in the 90s, that's a good example of that. But I mean, I think the system, it almost feels quaint now when we think about it, since it's completely outdated. It's just not how the industry works anymore. So nowadays, what you see on the right is a little bit closer to what happens. And one of the reasons for this is how social media really democratized access to trends, but it also provided the ability for essentially anyone to communicate with large groups of people. So thinking about the people standing in Miranda Priestly's office, that gift that we saw on the previous page, fashion's original gatekeepers, the editors, creative directors, advertisers, they're now almost completely cut out of the mix when we think about this new system. So, and while I think we can all agree that the democratization of influence in fashion is a good thing, I mean, it's great for the industry, it's long overdue. It's also true that this wealth of opinions and this kind of avalanche of information, the rise of TikTok over the last 3 years, it's also kind of helped push ultra fast fashion into overdrive, resulting in kind of this mishmash of trends that are all happening simultaneously. So the fall of mass, more predictable trends, which is what we had happening for decades, and the rise of kind of hyper niche trends is something that a lot of brands are still grappling with. It's hard to know as a brand, especially when you're working so many months out, where to place your bets. It's essentially kind of what we're navigating is what I call fast food fashion. So it's a lot of ideas that are made to be disposable, almost in the same way that digital content is disposable. So let's look at this another way and understand a little bit more about the role that data has also played in getting us to where we currently are, because, social media didn't get us here alone. So at the top, we have the diffusion of innovation, which has described kind of the steady rise and fall of trends for more than half a century. So starting with innovators, we used to be able to track trends all the way through the market to late majority to laggards. And this was a really helpful tool for forecasters, for planners to really understand the life cycle of trends. This for a long time helped us make sure we didn't stay too long at the party. We didn't keep puff sleeves in the assortment for too long. But currently the diffusion looks a little bit more like what we see on the bottom. So what this chart shows is we kind of have two phenomena happening at the same time. So we have macro trends, which are kind of low and slow, and they seem like they're never going to end. I would put things like tie-dye, animal print, Y2K, 90s nostalgia, normcore, like they all sit in this bucket, right? We've all been shopping over the last 5 years. We've seen these kind of perpetually be in the stores. So things like this can live for 4 years, sometimes even longer. And this is happening because within this environment, when it's really hard to predict trends, brands become kind of over-reliant on the data sources that they use for decision making. So when brands are using forecasting models that are driven by artificial intelligence, or they're relying too heavily on sales data, they're only kind of parsing information that's come before. So what we get are therefore kind of slight variations on a theme, a slight colorway update to your tie-dye, or a slightly new denim shape that's still 90s influenced. And that creates really kind of these holding patterns for trends within the market. And then in front of that, we have these little kind of blips on the radar, kind of bubbling away underneath. And these are responses to cultural moments and social media trends. They have lifespans of like 1 to 4 months. They kind of rise seemingly out of nowhere, and they crash hard just as fast as they arrived. So, as you can see, for a lot of reasons, this is a tough landscape for brands to navigate. This is a tough landscape for consumers to navigate. It's sort of bordering on the impossible, but it's also fueling a culture of overconsumption. This idea that fashion is highly consumable, which is problematic for a lot of reasons. It's also fueling kind of a sea of sameness in the marketplace and a real loss of originality. So to give you an example, and we have probably all experienced this when we've been shopping the high street over the past few years, but stores can sometimes really look the same. Again, the data sources that they're using, that they're turning to, are leading them to the same key items at the same time. So what we see happening is kind of a loss of brand identity when brands are so focused on popular trends and so focused on what's happening in the market and what their competitors are doing. And brands engaging in this strategy, they're not making any customers feel seen and understood by doing this. And, while we've seen a lot of buzz about Shein, they had a sky high valuation last year. It's come down quite a bit, but that certainly created a lot of buzz. They're making efforts to enter the US market in a bigger way. They've just partnered with Forever 21. But the elephant in the room for this type of ultra trend driven, high volume product is that the quality is not good. Like, we know this, that's not a surprise. And they're putting a lot of resources into garments that can only be worn once or twice. So from a sustainability point of view, that's tough. And on this page, these are some recent tweets and some TikToks that show the impact on consumers. And this ultra kind of trend driven strategy has a fatal flaw. So disappointing customers on a regular basis is not a good long-term business plan. So customer retention is a real risk here. But let's flip the script here for a minute, right? So we've went on a journey. We've kind of learned, where the fashion industry was, where we are now, how we got here, what's happening. But what if we worked in a different way? What would it look like to put the customer at the heart of the business and base every decision on what they need in their lives and what's useful to them, what makes them feel good about themselves? So let's look at a few examples of brands that are breaking the mold when it comes to creating products that are customer-centric. So I'm going to go through a few pages here, and there's a few examples that are really standing out in the crowd. They're really providing apparel products that help customers feel seen and understood. So let's start with Lululemon. So they're really the first brand that I think of when it comes to customer centricity. Their focus on the customer is legendary in the industry, and it led them from uncomfortable sports bras to launching what is potentially a multi-billion-dollar category. So that's athletic footwear designed specifically for the needs of women. So let's dig into this a little bit. So how did Lululemon get from sports bras to shoes? So let's start with the unspoken need that they discovered. So they had a lot of customer data and feedback that was telling them that women were experiencing discomfort in their sports bras. So they got really curious, they dug deep, they talked to customers, they took body and foot scans to really understand the problem. And what they discovered was that the issue wasn't related to bras at all, that it was actually related to inferior footwear technology that didn't properly absorb the shock waves that women specifically experience when they're running. So a lot of footwear technology had been developed in the industry with a male focus over the years, and this had just kind of become the norm over time. So as for their product, the Blissfeel running shoe is the first of its kind that's actually aimed directly at the unique physical needs of women. So they believe that women deserve better technology than what they were being offered in the market, and they spent years developing it and perfecting it. So this is really important for a couple of reasons. Lululemon, they could have read the bra feedback and invested some R&D into bras. They could have redesigned a few of them, done a marketing push behind their new and improved bras, and it might have added some incremental growth, but it wouldn't have fixed the problem, right? Women would still have been experiencing issues when they were running because they hadn't really gotten to the core of it. But because Lululemon got curious, and because they talked to thousands of customers and really committed themselves to understanding and solving the problem, now they've developed what's potentially a multi-billion-dollar category that puts them even closer to competing directly with Nike. So compared to the fast fashion examples that we saw on the previous pages, I mean, this is night and day, right? This is a totally different way of thinking, a different way of working. They've created a project that's genuinely useful and improves the lives and experiences of the people using it. And it all comes down to having a customer-centric approach. So this shows that focusing on the customer can actually be incredibly good for business. Okay, and then for the second example here, let's look at Aerie's recent collaboration with Liberaire on the line of adaptive lingerie. So the unmet need here is that adaptive lingerie has been around for years, but it was really all function and no beauty. So it made shopping and dressing kind of feel like a chore for the millions of Americans with disabilities. So what happened was a new wave of advocates came along, really shining a light on the basic right of every woman to feel empowered through her clothing choices. And as for the product, Liberaire's founder, Emma Butler, asked some friends of hers with disabilities to write about what it means to feel fashionable and confident and sexy as a disabled or as a chronically ill woman. So she took this information, took this data and these insights to design a truly beautiful and unique line of intimates that are highly functional, but also very fashionable, very beautiful. And you know, this product matters because about 1 in 4 Americans live with a disability. So this is a group that largely feels unseen when they're shopping. So beautiful adaptive apparel is bringing back self-confidence and dignity to this underserved area of the market. And I think this is such a perfect example of customer-centric design that really makes a positive impact in people's lives. So again, if you think about it compared to some of the things we looked at in the previous section, like again, it's just night and day when you're creating products that are really based around the consumer and how they can feel and how they can really use products within their lives. Okay, so we've been on quite the journey today. So we've looked at the evolution of the trend cycle, and we've looked at examples of brands that are putting customers first. They're creating some really great products. So lastly today, let's talk about solutions. So how can we do better? What's some kind of tactical advice that you can take away today? And really the first step is investing in consumer research to build a consumer profile that you can base your brand strategy or your product designs on. But when you're a student or when you're building a startup, doing a lot of expensive primary research is obviously not going to be an option. So let's explore how to gain these insights and build solid personas without breaking the bank. So first here, you can start with gathering consumer insights. So there's some really cheap, scrappy ways to do this. You can do social media research, look at comments that people have made about brands. So kind of do a little bit of social listening there. You can also recruit people for one-to-one interviews or focus groups. So this can be done. You can find people in Facebook groups, friends, families, coworkers. You can use Google Form surveys to collect data about customers. And to make the most of these sessions, before you start and before you decide what questions you want to ask, you want to formulate the hypotheses that you want to test. So maybe you want to test the idea that your customer is craving more stylish options that are sustainable, or maybe your hypothesis is that your customer might be frustrated by the lack of plus size options in activewear, and you want to dig into this idea a little bit more. So figure out your hypothesis, build out a questionnaire, fill it with all your burning questions that you want to know. And then if you're wondering what questions to ask also, I have a free giveaway coming up in a minute. So I'll give you a QR code for that in a couple of minutes. So most important here is to keep an open mind when you're doing this type of research. So one of the most valuable insights is to disprove a hypothesis. You don't want to pour a lot of time and energy into an idea that just isn't hitting the mark. So, keep your eyes open, keep your ears open, really listen to what people are saying, and really think about, like, what are those hidden needs? Sometimes what people aren't saying, or sometimes digging in a little bit further can be helpful here. So next, you'll take the data that you gathered from these interviews and surveys, and you'll start to look for patterns that are emerging. So you're going to look for patterns that emerge, like traits that they're showing, preferences for products, demographics, psychographics, and you want to aim for kind of 1 to 2 clusters just to keep it simple. So like a lot of people seem to be looking for luxury vintage, or a lot of people feel like their outerwear doesn't keep them warm in the winter. So depending on what questions you're asking, obviously your clusters will look very different. But, as you're doing this research, you want to keep an ear and an eye out for patterns that are happening. And once you've found the commonalities, then you want to build a semi-fictional story around it. So think of the people that you interviewed and create kind of an amalgamation that conveys the key characteristics of this customer. And once you have the persona built out, use it. Filter all your product development and marketing decisions through this persona. And, always ask the question, like, would this resonate with this person? And if not, like, what can I do to kind of tweak this design? Do I need to make it more comfortable? Do I need to change the seam placement? Like, what can I do to really make this work for this customer? And as I mentioned, I have a cheat sheet to share with the group today. So you can access Moonshot's Customer Insights Checklist at the QR code here. So this QR code, I'll leave it up here for a second. This will take you directly to this report. And if you scroll down, this page is kind of towards the bottom of the report. But, if you're looking for a way to get started and then kind of figuring out what questions you want to kind of ask or think about for your customer, this is a really great way to start. And you might want to inject some other questions in there that are more specific based on kind of whatever product you're developing or what you're interested in. But, these are great kind of catch-all questions that'll help give you a really good sense of the customer. So I'll pause here for a second. This is the last page. So I'll leave this code up here for a second. And then Chloe, I think you mentioned that we were going to have some time for Q&A now. So I'm very happy to answer any questions that anybody has.
Absolutely, yeah. So if you don't feel comfortable, speaking up and asking your question out loud, you're more than welcome to write it in the chat. I will pass it on to Katie. One thing that I thought would be super, super helpful for our students and everybody else who is attending, you mentioned the term psychographics. I'm not sure that that's something that our students have heard very often. Do you think you could kind of expand on that a little bit and explain kind of its importance as it relates to the topic?
Yeah, sure. So we've heard of demographics, right? So we know what those are. That's kind of like where people live, how old they are, how many people live in their household. So kind of like more statistical things like that. But psychographics are a little bit mushier, like a little bit more gray area. So it's kind of getting into more about like people's views on things and how they feel about what are their opinions on certain things or certain clothing or certain things that are happening culturally. So it's kind of just getting a little bit more kind of into that qualitative area of research. But yeah, so a lot of the questions that are on the checklist here are more kind of psychographic driven. But getting people to describe their personal style, kind of getting their opinions on things like that. that's what that research is.
Amazing. Yeah. I don't want to take too many questions away, but I did have one more that I was really curious to get your thoughts on. So fast fashion, we're very aware that we're in the midst of that right now. Do you think that that's something that's here to stay, or do you think it's like kind of an ebb and flow thing where we'll return eventually to kind of the traditional model?
Yeah, so my personal take on that is that I think we're going to start to see regulation happening over the next kind of 5+ years that's going to make it very difficult for fast fashion or specifically like ultra fast fashion companies to operate. So we're starting to see some of this regulation happening in Europe. So keep an eye on Europe and what's happening there. But I do think there will eventually be a domino effect. But brands are going to start to become responsible for the life cycle of their products at some point. And so the business models that they're creating where they're putting so many garments out into the world just isn't going to be like financially possible anymore. So I think that will kind of force brands to work in a different way. So I feel very strongly about regulation and how that's going to change the system. But I also think like I do so much consumer research. I'm talking to customers on a weekly basis, and what I'm seeing happening in interviews, especially with younger consumers who are kind of in their early 20s, is that they're really, really moving away from fast fashion in a big way and specifically choosing to buy quality over quantity. They're shopping vintage more. They're just looking for a little bit more longevity and purchases that just feel a little more satisfying to them. So that's something I've been tracking over the last few years. And this year, especially in these interviews, it's coming through very strongly. So I do think we're starting to see kind of a shift in priorities happening. But again, it kind of comes back to this idea that you can buy kind of the fast fashion garments like so many times, but if you get burned enough, eventually I think consumers are kind of coming to the realization that like only being able to wear it once or having it break while you're wearing it is just like not a good experience. And so I do think that is driving some change also.
Absolutely. Yeah. I definitely can attest to that. I've bought one too many H&M things where my straps have like fallen off or seams come
Right.
undone. And I'm like, oh my gosh, why did I spend the $20 instead of,
Yeah,
yeah.
it happens. And like when I was doing research for this deck, for some of the fast fashion fails, so many of them involve shoes. So like imagine if you're like out in the middle of the city and your shoes break. It's like that's terrible.
I know I saw that one. I think it was a tweet that was like, my shoes melted.
Right? Yes, exactly. That is not good.
Definitely not. Does anybody else have any questions for our speaker while we have her here? I'll give pause.
I have a question.
Hi,
Go for
sure.
it.
Hi. Well, I kind of like got in a little bit late, so I don't know if you talked about this. I have two questions. So you were talking about how nowadays trends tend to be all over the place, right?
Mhm.
So, well, if you're starting, obviously you need to like target someone like to gain public kind of like a little bit fast, right? So what would you recommend someone who's starting to gather like consumers, but also not losing their identity to like please all these trends that are going on?
Yeah, that's such a great question. I think, part of it, and this is what I think is one of the things I love about the fashion education system. I'm a trained designer too, and one of the things I think is amazing about that process is that like while you're working on these projects and while you're doing the coursework, it really gives you a chance to kind of like tap into your identity as a designer and start to get a sense of what's important to you and what do you kind of gravitate towards. And this is how designers have designed for centuries, literally. And so I think we've kind of gotten away from that in the industry the last couple decades, like with things moving quickly. But if you go back and you look at examples of like Donna Karan, like I'm such a Donna Karan fan. I think she's a great example of a designer who kind of came up through the ranks and had such a strong idea of the impact she wanted to have on women's lives and how she wanted to support, women who were entering the workforce at a certain time in their lives. And, she built capsule wardrobes that were really all about supporting women and helping, make their lives easier as they're working and kind of climbing the corporate ladder. So I think, that's a great example of kind of like getting in touch with what really matters to you and what you're interested in when it comes to people and how that connects to fashion. For some people, it might be that they're passionate about kind of exploring extended size ranges and really kind of digging into comfort and function and everything there. It could also be that it's really kind of more around sustainability and you're really passionate about trying new dye techniques or new fabrics. And so it'll be different for everybody, but I think, think about that as you're going through your projects and try to really connect with what's exciting to you personally. And then how can you kind of connect that to a consumer group and really have an effect basically on them.
Thank you. That helped a lot. And my second question is, so wait, there's a little bit of noise. So, how do you? I'm kind of like interested in freelancing. Do you have any advice on how to get yourself out there in regards of when you're just starting, basically, as a designer doing freelance?
Yeah, so my top tip to people, I mean, whether you're in college and entering the industry soon or whether you're already in the industry, is really it's down in networking. And so I'm a member of a few groups like the Collab. They're mainly based in the New York area, but they're a great group of fashion professionals, at all levels of the industry. So that's a great way to meet people, like going to industry events and just kind of networking and talking to people that way. And then another way is just kind of using channels that you're comfortable with. So if you're on social media or like LinkedIn has been really helpful for me, but finding like that place on the internet that feels good for you and then, sharing some of your work and kind of putting things out into the world, I think is really important also. The thing that I've learned as a business owner, I started out doing all the channels all the time and I didn't need to do that. So I found the one that worked for me, which was LinkedIn. Other people that I work with really go all in on Instagram or others are all in on TikTok. But I think it's different for everybody. But I do think that it's really important to create, if you're a designer and constantly be putting kind of things out into the world that helps people understand how you think, how you work, what you're capable of. So especially when you're starting out, I think that's really important. So hopefully that's helpful.
All right, thank you.
All right. Anybody else? Well, we have Katie here with us today. All right. So you guys are always very welcome to send me any questions that you have, maybe come up with after the fact, and I can try and forward them on to Katie and see if she can make some time to send an answer my way. If you did join a little bit late, you can always access the recording for this webinar next week on our website, nysd.edu. And I want to thank you so much, Katie, for your time. Thank you, everybody who joined us for your time. And we will see you for our next webinar in October.
Thanks, Chloe. This was great. I'm happy to answer any questions through email. So yeah, feel free to send them through.
Amazing. All right. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you, Katie. Have a great evening.
Bye.
Bye.